warm welcome to this very special show on ET Now. As we step into the new year and try to put what was hopefully the worst of the pandemic behind us, we at ET Now are delighted to bring our viewers an interaction with Dr. Raghuram Rajan, former Governor, Reserve Bank of India, presently Professor of Finance at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. Prior to taking over as RBI Governor, Dr. Rajan served as Chief Economic Advisor, Government of India, and also as Chief Economist, International Monetary Fund. So he brings to the table a rare blend of domestic and international experience and across both the fiscal and the monetary policy spheres. Welcome to the show, Dr. Rajan.
Thank you for having me.
It's almost a year to the day we spoke in January 2021. And though the pandemic has not entirely disappeared, we've seen a sea change in the state of the global economy, India included. At the beginning of 2021, global growth had contracted 3.5%, and India was expected to contract 7.5%. Of course, we ended the year a little bit better at 7.3%. But now in Jan 2022, things are very different. The global economy is estimated to have grown at 6% in 2021, while India is expected to grow at 9.2%. So let me begin by asking you, how do you see global growth in 2022? Will the recovery continue, or will it peter out in the face of Omicron? We'll come to India later, but for now, your view of the global economy, Raghu.
Well, I think the global economy is buoyed by a substantial reservoir of demand. So notwithstanding the Omicron virus and the devastation it is already causing, I think there will be a slowdown in this quarter's activity, but it'll get pushed a little further. That said, I would resist the temptation to say we've seen the worst, the virus is behind us. This virus is ever morphing. As you know, when we talked in early last year, we didn't imagine the extent to which Delta would be vicious. And of course, Omicron there could be variants which are far more deadly than this one. So, I think we should have a cautious optimism that there is globally sufficient sort of pent-up demand, reservoirs of stimulus, that the economy will still grow quite substantially, the global economy next year, or this year, I should say. But we still have to be careful in making too many strong predictions given the ever-morphing virus.
When we turn specifically to India's growth story, advanced estimates for 21-22 suggest the Indian economy is back to where it was for the pre-pandemic years, with growth projected to grow at 9.2 this fiscal. However, many experts, including your predecessor at the Reserve Bank of India, Dr. Subba Rao, argue that what we are going in for is a two-speed recovery, a K-shaped recovery, with those in the bottom of the pyramid, such as those in the informal sector workers, yet to recover much lost ground. Would you agree? And what are the dangers of a K-shaped recovery? Well,
I think there are bright spots and dark spots in the Indian economy. And I think we should be aware of both. It's wrong to be overly pessimistic. It's wrong to be excessively optimistic. On the optimistic side, because of the tremendous global demand, I think any exporting industry is starting to do really quite well. And of course, the IT industry is going gangbusters at this point. I spoke with an IT CEO the other day who said it's just impossible to find workers in India today. So same phenomenon as in the US. So that's benefiting from global demand. Also, maybe some larger companies have paid down their debts. They're showing high profits. They're now focusing more on automation. That's also increasing demand for IT in the country. So that's one side of it. And take also any kind of industry targeting the rich, Asian Paints, people like that. They're doing very well because there is a lot of pent-up demand. The upper middle class in service jobs have been able to continue working during the pandemic without stop. And so things are going quite well for that sector. On the other hand, take the lower middle class, take those in high contact service industries, etc. And they've had a very, very rough time. And the numbers, for example, the fact that agriculture has increased employment from 36% of the labor force to 39%. I mean, no growing country increases employment in agriculture. You want to keep bringing down employment in agriculture. And that's saying we have a real problem with the lower end jobs, that if people find going back to agriculture better than staying in the cities and doing those jobs because they've disappeared or they've shrunk, it is an enormous source of concern. And so what I think you have to worry about is that the lower middle class has been deeply affected. And of course, there are all these numbers floating around, how many have slipped from middle to lower middle, from lower middle to poverty, and any of those numbers are really alarming. They're all crude because we don't get at this informal segment of the economy. We don't measure it properly, but any numbers there are quite alarming. You talk to small and medium enterprises, they are in a fair amount of difficulty. So the bright spot, the big enterprises, the export enterprises, the not so bright spots, in fact, the dark spots, the informal sector, the small and medium enterprises, even agriculture. I mean, if you look at two-wheeler sales, for example, which is propped up, the lower end of the two-wheeler propped up by strong agricultural demand, even that is not showing up as strongly. So we have a real consumption problem. And that's because the lower end, less well-off segments of our population have done really quite badly in this recession. Look at consumption, for example. You said we've got back to where we were in terms of growth, but look at consumption. It fell tremendously last year, and it's come up only by about 6.8% this year. So it's below where it was. And consumption falling, while the upper middle class is growing quite strongly, means the lower middle class, as well as the poor, have suffered quite substantially. So we ignore this at our peril because it's telling us this is where all the problems start in the economy, but it's also where our future lies, right? So before I end on this dark segment, think of the kids who haven't been in school. They've been out of school now in some states for 2 years. How do you get them back? And unless you have a pathway for getting them back into school, back into learning, they've actually fallen 3 years behind because they've forgotten a year worth of school, having not been in a proper school since then. And so when you get them back, their parents are going to say, where are you? What are you doing? And they will figure out that these kids are just not keeping up if they brought back into the same class in the same way. And as a result, you're going to see a very high dropout rate, many more girls getting married off, boys put into agricultural jobs, low-end jobs. Our future is at stake if we don't bring these kids back into school in the proper way. And so I think these are some of the things we should be thinking about seriously across the country. It's not one state or it's not a center. It's everyone has to think about this and how to remedy it.
So clearly the recovery and the economy needs more support. So the question is what sort? Monetary, fiscal. Has monetary policy in India reached the dead end in the sense it's a much more broad brush approach? Can fiscal policy be better in these circumstances, but can be more targeted at the groups that really need that help? What is your view?
I will stay off commenting on monetary policy. That's a rule I have certainly in India. I'm happy if you want to talk about any other country, I'm happy to talk. But in general, in an environment like this, there's only so much that monetary policy can do. You can't push credit. If people are finding it difficult to borrow, if lenders are themselves strapped because of growing exposure to one sector or the other, credit flows are tepid at best, and that's the situation when you look at Indian credit from the banking sector. Yes, there's some other stuff that's coming in, fintechs, NBFCs, and so on, but it's nowhere near enough to substitute for the slower growth. I mean, 6% growth, remember, is nominal growth, when in fact, when you add inflation to our real growth, it's 15, 16, 17%, depending on what index you use. And so we're actually shrinking in terms of credit when you have only 6 or 7% growth in credit. So Clearly, something needs to be done there, both in increasing the demand for credit, but also increasing the potential supply for it. Some of that involves doing the old homework we still haven't finished, which is cleaning up the banking sector and so on. Monetary policy cannot do very much there. On the fiscal side, I think you mentioned more targeted sort of measures, and I think there is room for fairly targeted measures focused on the urban poor, the urban lower middle class. I mean, one of the realizations during this pandemic was that we don't have much of a safety net for workers in urban areas. And it really is important to think about what kind of safety net. Manrega works in the rural areas. Do we really need people to go back to their villages in order to get Manrega? And Manrega, as you know, is being used in a very, very big way even now, maybe 40% above normal levels of Manrega use. So do we need a urban safety net so as to keep the migrants in the cities, but with some support so that they don't have to go back to their villages every time there is a calamity? It's also important to attract them back to the cities. If they feel that there is no safety net, they're going to be more reluctant while this pandemic is still on. Those are some of the targeted measures that one might think, and they have a long-term staying power also. That urban safety net is something we have to think about and should have been thinking about for some time. So should we put in place some of those? At this point, I think on the food side, we've largely targeted everybody who needed grains. Are there other kinds of food? If Omicron lasts for some time, are there other kinds that we need to do? Should we do more cash transfers to the weaker sections of the population? Those are things to think about. I would emphasize that yes, we don't have unlimited budgets, but that means we have to spend much more carefully, but we should spend in a more targeted way. And it is not for a country of our size and our per capita GDP, it does make sense to take care of the poorest.
Raghu, I know you said that you would not like to comment specifically on India's monetary policy, but there's one question I just cannot resist asking you, that you took over at a very similar juncture when after the 2008 crisis, there'd been excessive, perhaps in hindsight, I agree, monetary policy easing. So is there a sense that the lessons of 2008 have not been learned? Because while the US Fed has accepted that high inflation is not transitory, we in India seem a little reluctant to accept that inflation seems to be fairly deeply entrenched. So is it a sense that it's, we haven't really quite learned the lessons of how easy monetary policy can result in entrenching inflationary expectations?
Look, I'll follow my rule and say I really can't comment on recent monetary policy moves. I'll comment more generally on the idea that yes, inflation gets entrenched over time, and the more it gets entrenched, the harder it is to push back. I think that we have an inflation targeting framework, which I think has served us well in the sense that if we had confronted these kinds of problems during the pandemic without such a framework, perhaps the expectations of fiscal policy and its effect on interest rates would have been much sort of more adverse to us. The notion that the RBI is watching inflation and we keep it under control helps us borrow at relatively reasonable rates. The fact that the GSEC is still in this 6% range is something that I think is not unconnected to the fact that we have that framework. And so our real rate, the real interest rate in India is pretty much close to zero, which wouldn't have been the case in the past. Now, that said, you cannot get complacent in any country about inflation. And if you have a framework, that framework has to benefit from that you actually believe in it and you're going to implement it. And so we have a framework which is centered around 4%. And I think what the markets over time will look for is that we focus on bringing inflation back to the midpoint. And that's where the expectations should center around.
Well, another area that I think all of us in India are keeping an eye on, particularly, and is a hot potato at the moment, is cryptocurrencies. What is your view? Is there really a use case for cryptocurrencies, or are they a passing fad? Do they pose a threat to the macroeconomic stability? And how should central banks, respond? Should we in India perhaps have done more to put investors on their guard?
Well, cryptocurrencies come in different flavors, right? So there's the traditional cryptocurrency like Bitcoin. There is the stable coin like Tether and so on. So they're different kinds. Now, some of them are being used for payments. Typically, payments which either are in the crypto world itself to buy crypto assets, or in the past, a lot more was used for illegal payments. And some of it is being used for cross-border hawala, basically to escape capital controls. And of course, in some countries with a terrible currency which is inflating at very high rates, what you're getting is an effective replacement of the domestic currency by a cryptocurrency. Not because the authorities want it, but because private people prefer trading in the crypto, Bitcoin or whatever, than trading in the official currency. So there are varieties of uses of that kind. Now, is there a crypto which is used widely in public by people? Not yet. And my sense is by the time that comes, central banks will have figured out, what a reasonable central bank digital currency will look like. And they will want that to be the main vehicle for transactions. So any crypto has to deal with the possibility that central banks will come in. Now, a lot of crypto mythology is about central banks are inflating away the fiat currency, and therefore this is the last haven, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, you see these cryptos fluctuate in value. It's not that they're stable value. You see Bitcoin go up 20%, come down 20%, sometimes, large moves on the same day. So the notion that these are stable forms of payment relative to the fiat currencies, the central bankers cannot be trusted, but this crypto can be trusted, I think that's a small minority of people who think that. Now, so broadly, I'm saying there's no large-scale use case as present. There are niche use cases. Now, what are people betting on? They're betting on, one crypto becoming a dominant force. That may be the case, but it requires new uses, not the traditional payments for which we have so many. I mean, UPI in India is fantastic. Why would you need an alternative to UPI? Well, maybe a separate rail so as to reduce risks in the system, but not so much that the technology doesn't work. So where does the crypto come in? It comes in two forms. One is microtransactions, where you really can't, it's too costly to do the transaction every second, but you can do it with cryptos because it's all automated. So that's one possibility. Not yet a big use. Second possibility is smart contracts. In securities business, I have to deliver a security and I get payment. A smart contract can do it without a third-party involvement. So in many cross-border transactions, when you don't want a third party involved, these smart contracts can work. So there are places they can be used, but you don't see a lot of that used yet. Will there be this killer application, this killer crypto? Possibly. But which one of the 6,000 cryptos will it be? Tether, starts making some claims that it will be that. Who knows? The point I'm trying to make is for somebody who has limited resources, cryptos are not the safe investment you want to be in. You could lose all your money if you invest in the wrong crypto. You could lose all your money if cryptos become less of a fad than they are because there's no substantial use case yet. Now, will one of them become, the currency of the future? Perhaps. And certainly central banks will try and give it competition. But we're still far from that. And so it is a very speculative investment.
So if you were to advise the government, whether as chief economic advisor or as Reserve Bank of India governor, what would your 1, 2, 3 priority areas be?
Look, well, first, they have plenty of good advisors, so they don't need me to give advice. I mean, I certainly would not ignore the side of the economy which is doing badly. I mean, it's tempting to look at the stock market and say, no problems. But in fact, if you ignore the hurting part, we have longer term problems, as we talked about in terms of education and so on. So you need to worry about that tremendously. I would certainly, if there's a resource constraint, think about enhancing the pace of the asset sales, not just companies, but also potentially surplus land, etc. Those can be beneficial for the economy and putting them to better use. But those are things that we need to think about. And I would move away from raising tariffs and so on. In fact, we should be thinking about pulling off or bringing down some of what we've done. But that debate, I think, will continue in India. More broadly, I would like to see a vision of what is it that we're trying to do? Where is it that we're trying to go? And my sense is that any kind of vision that emphasizes our strengths will include the fact that we are a democratic country with rule of law, with a judicial system that can go against the government. Those are our strengths and will be the way we build our new economy. So I would like to see an articulation of some of that, rather than a blind aping of the way that China went or some East Asian country went. We are not those countries, and we don't have the ability to go in the direction that they went. The budget, for whatever it's worth, is the central statement by the government. And I think there's a chance for the government to make a statement that shows that it has thought about where we're going and has a sense of how that can be made possible. And clarifies, what our view is on a variety of issues, including foreign investors, including privatization and so on. So I think I would see the budget document not so much as raising tariff A and providing subsidy B, but really a document which says, this is the path I choose over the next 5 years. And every year we update it a little, but that path, that vision seems relatively constant.
Thank you so much, Raghu. It's been delightful speaking to you.
Thank you, and same to you.